all the founders of modern science, whether it be Sir Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle, all of these people thought that nature provided concrete evidence that there was a creator. So when the founders of America said all men are created equal, endowed by their creator, they weren't just making a faith statement. They were also, and of course I think the Bible provides good evidence of things, but they weren't just saying that, well, that's because of what the Bible says. They also thought that nature herself, and the Bible itself teaches this, pointed to God.
Dr. John West is an individual we've had on the program before. More recently, we talked with him about his book, The Stockholm Syndrome, Christianity. In the past, he's also, of course, written The Darwin Day in America, How Our Politics and Culture Have Been Dehumanized. He is the Vice President and Senior Fellow at the Science-Based Discovery Institute, serves as the Managing Editor of the Institute Center for Science. In the past, has served in a number of locations and positions as professor, associate professor, for example, of political science at Seattle Pacific University. And Dr. John West, welcome back to Point of View.
Kerby, thanks for having me.
I enjoyed hearing you at, of course, the Discovery Institute event here in Dallas. And this book, I think, when we heard you speak, was on the first part about kind of history and philosophy. But before we're through, we're going to talk about science and scientific racism and the whole bias that we see there, as well as it kind of leads naturally into this movie, The Story of Everything, doesn't it?
It does. So I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Well, let's talk about this idea of America's founding. First of all, people are going to enjoy reading this because not only do you give us some of the history of the Declaration on America 250, but you've got lots of great pictures, some of which I've seen, many that I have not, which talk about the significance of the Declaration of Independence, pictures of people like President Coolidge, placing him there, pictures of what was happening when we were actually trying to encourage people, especially during the bicentennial, to actually read this document. But in some respects, you wanted this to begin our conversation about how we started with an assumption that we were created in God's image. But by the 19th century, especially Charles Darwin, we moved away from it. So first of all, let's, if we can, maybe come back to why this is so significant, because I refer to oftentimes as the Declaration as giving us the why of American government, and then the Constitution gives us the how of American government. But you recognize that when Thomas Jefferson and the other individuals as part of that committee put the Declaration together, they were drawing on many other sources, weren't they?
Definitely. And in fact, Jefferson himself basically claimed no originality for the ideas. He said he was trying to express really the common sentiments of Americans at the time, and really the great tradition of liberty that had been developing that certainly I would say that the Bible played into a key role, and also others. And so, they were trying to express really their common sentiments of the time. And I do think, I like how you put, the Declaration providing the why and the Constitution the how. For well-attuned people here may have seen over the past week, there's some controversy online and discussion back and forth about Justice Clarence Thomas, who gave a really splendid speech at the University of Texas, Austin, just a few days ago, where he made that same point, which is that the Constitution is really important because it implements things, but if you want to understand why it's implementing things and what it's actually implementing and the reasons for it, you need to go to the Declaration. And I think that is, we've actually seen, as I talk in my book, an attack really on the founding principles of the Declaration on both left and right. And on the right, it's manifested itself in and some on Christians, conservatives, which I would account myself one, but people saying, we're not, America really isn't based on a creed, we're based on blood and soil. That, if you're a Christian and you came from Europe, then that makes you an American and nothing else. And, that's actually not the view the founders had, even early on, and it's not the view that I think really expresses the ideas of America. I think G.K. Chesterton, who wasn't even an American, got it right in the 1920s when he visited America and said, America is really the only nation he knew about that was based on a creed. And he actually talked about that Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And basically, it's because of that that just governments have to be based on the consent of the governed. And I think we as Americans are selling ourselves short if we don't recognize the uniqueness of that, and also if we want our country to continue just how imperative it is that we teach this to our kids and that we ourselves understand what it means. Because there's a lot of confusion today about what, even ideas like all men are created equal. What does that mean? Because people recognize that humans have lots of differences, and we're not equal in a lot of ways. And that's true. And certainly America's founders understood that. That's not what they were getting at. And so I think that we need to, one of the hardest things to do is not just founding something, but perpetuating.
Yes.
This was actually a point that Abraham Lincoln made in one of his famous speeches, that, you can found something well, but then how do you pass it down to the next generation? I think that's the question we're facing right now in America.
I think so. First of all, I might just mention that I'm holding up our booklet that we made available recently on a biblical point of view on the Declaration, and I open with the G.K. Chesterton quote, and that's the first quote in, of course, your first chapter. But let me, if I can, maybe talk about the fact that, and I'll hold up another book, this one by Walter Isaacson, The Greatest Sentence Ever Written, because in some respects, when we look at it now, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Originally, Jefferson said, we hold these truths to be sacred, but you're laughing because I suspect you're familiar with the book and probably cite it as well.
Actually, I'm laughing because Walter Isaacson is produced one of the worst books about the Declaration of Independence. So he argues, and unfortunately, some Christians, like very distinguished Vishal Mangalwadi, who I love, but have bought into this, and it's a historical myth. So he points out, yes, in one of the drafts that originally it was, these truths are sacred and undeniable. And then it got changed in the drafting process to, we hold these truths to be self-evident.
Right.
And Isaacson's claim, and the claim of many secularists now, based off of Isaacson, is that, well, that change indicated that the founders were rejecting the idea that these ideas were somehow consonant with Christianity or had a Christian influence on it, and that they were just going for rational, secularist science, and that Ben Franklin was responsible for that.
Yep.
Well, as I deconstructed my book, this is just false on many levels. Number one, we actually don't know who made the change. In fact, there's a dispute among actual scholars. The penmanship may well have been in Thomas Jefferson. So we don't actually know who made the change. So this whole story is premised on, well, Ben Franklin was commandeering the process, which is also kind of ridiculous because Thomas Jefferson was not a Christian. I mean, he believed in God, but he was also Unitarian.
And John, I thought it would be good to come back and explain that there are a lot of Christian sources, obviously, for the Declaration, whether it's John Locke or William Blackstone or going all the way back to Lex Rex and Samuel Rutherford, but not to mention the fact that even as you read through that, we talk about the laws of nature and nature's God. We are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. They appeal to the protection of divine providence. They are appealing to the supreme judge of the world. Sounds pretty Christian to me. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, you really can't understand the Declaration and its meaning without understanding the Christian tradition. Let me just to wrap up what we were discussing before the break. This idea that the use of these truths are self-evident somehow meant that it was anti-Christian is really preposterous. All that phrase means is that reasonable people who are attuned to reality and that they ought to be able to recognize that these truths are plainly true. And there was nothing going against the Bible or Christian revelation and the drafters. There was a committee of several people. It wasn't just Jefferson. Jefferson was the main drafter, but he had input from other people. And those drafters included devout Christians, even though Jefferson wasn't a devout Christian. But some of the other drafters were. And so it's just this idea that even some Christians have bought into, that saying we hold these truths to be self-evident is somehow anti-Christian is preposterous. Now, the key point which some Christians today don't understand, is that at the time of the founding, whether there were evangelical Christians like John Witherspoon, who was the Presbyterian minister who signed the Declaration, or someone like Jefferson, who was more of a Unitarian and didn't believe Jesus was God. They both agreed, however, that reason, revelation, the Bible and common sense, if you will, or the Bible and our rational faculties, all pointed to the same truths. And so they thought they went together. And this was really the standard Christian view of things, that God, both when you talk about the laws of nature and nature's God. Well, what are those? Well, those are the laws in the Bible, the moral laws in the Bible, but they're also the laws that God has written on our heart, that Paul talks about in Romans 2. And that, again, if you go from Augustine up to people like Calvin, to more modern times, people like C.S. Lewis, this idea that morality is not just taught in the Bible, it's also written on our consciences by God. And so there's a common ground between whether you're Christian or not in the area of morality. That has been the standard Christian claim of the standard Christian tradition. And the founders were articulating that when they start the Declaration, appealing to the laws of nature and of nature's God. That actual phrase, you find it in Locke,
right.
But Locke's getting it from Hooker, and then Hooker's getting it from Aquinas. So it's, this is deep in Christian theology. And then, of course, where do we get the idea that we're created equal? That does go back to the biblical teaching that we're created in God's image. And I go in my book, because in my experience of teaching over 1,000 students about the Declaration in my years of teaching, many really don't understand that. And some at least understand, well, we're equal in our rights, or we're equal in the eyes of God. Well, that's true, but that doesn't get specific enough. What does it mean that we're created, equal? The founders really had at least 7 different ways that they articulated that, and it starts with the idea that the founders knew that human beings as a class are exceptional. We're not like other animals. And so what makes us unique, that where each of us are much more equal and equivalent to each other than any of us are to a rat, for example? Well, it's our rational capabilities, it's our moral capabilities, it's the desire for God, it's that we have souls that go after death, which founder James Wilson talked about. And then, of course, on the negative side, and this is something that the French Revolution got wrong, and a lot of the other places, is that we're sinful. We're not perfectible.
Right.
We're equally sinful. There's no human being who is so good and so superior that they should be treated with godlike powers against other human beings, because we're all sinful. And that's something the founders believed, and that's actually, I think, one of the real differences between the American experiment and in many other experiments in since then.
And I might just mention, you do quote, of course, from James Madison, Federalist Paper number 51, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary." But even from a biblical point of view, you have the quote from Acts 17, "Because we're all made of one blood, all nations of men," because we're setting that up in just a few minutes when we talk about scientific racism and the Second American Revolution, because this idea of equality is something that by the 19th century was changed dramatically because of Charles Darwin, wasn't it?
Yeah, and even before Charles Darwin, but Darwin, I think, solidified it the most. But pre-Darwin, there were a number of people like Louis Agassiz and others who were arguing that, despite what the Bible says, actually different, say, races or ethnicities, they're created separately. We're not all descended from Adam and Eve, basically. And so that was in the air, so to speak, by the early 19th century. And then this really did lead to a repudiation of the teaching of the Declaration of Independence. And one way that you can just see that is that after the Declaration happened, yes, there was slavery, but something like 7 or 8 states ended up abolishing slavery. Some, like in New York, the date of emancipation was July 4th. Well, why was that? Because they're pointing that they understood that you can't proclaim that all men are created equal and then have slaves. We did have slavery, but they were embarrassed by it. We had Jefferson and Madison actually propose legislation, even in Virginia, that there would be emancipation. Unfortunately, it failed. But then what happened? By the early 19th century, you had this rise of scientific racism. First, pre-Darwin, and then Darwin solidified it by basically arguing that, well, maybe we all did come from some ancestral group, but they weren't humans, and then you can rank humans on where they are on the evolutionary scale. So people from Africa are supposed to be at the very base of, but right when we came, from the apes, and then it's the blacks, and then you have this racial hierarchy that that basically Darwin and his followers said was grounded in modern science, and that was a key repudiation of really the founding document of America. And then there are many other ways that Darwinism actually repudiated the Declaration, which we can get into, but certainly the human equality was a key way.
I know we'll get us into eugenics and a variety of others, but one of the things, John, that I appreciated about your book is when I've many times taught on creation evolution, if I have time, I will talk about the impact of Darwinian theory, and I show a picture of Ota Benga, which you have a picture of, who was a man from Africa brought to the United States and put in a primate house with the apes in the Bronx Zoo, which shows that even in the early part of the 20th century, some of those ideas of scientific racism were still around, weren't they?
They were, and it's to be noted that this wasn't just a freak thing. This was pushed by some of the leading scientists of the time, and when Ota Benga was put on display along with in the primate house in a cage, this was actually defended by the New York Times. And it was the black and white ministers who said, no, you don't do this with a human being, and human beings aren't apes. But it was the New York Times who actually editorialized that there was nothing wrong with this. But it was the Christian ministers who, based on believing that God created human beings, basically tried to object.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, I want to get into this whole idea of the scientocracy and the whole development of eugenics and where some of this came from, because once you put your mind to reject the idea of a creator and that we are endowed by a creator with certain inalienable rights, once you no longer believe that all men are created equal, you begin to head down that road. And this is why I would certainly want to recommend this book, because it's 200 pages, but about 150 pages of content, and then whole sections on resources for digging deeper, because that is important, and then lots of endnotes, because I guarantee you, as you start reading through this book, there are going to be a few times you're going to say, I have never heard that. Is that really true? And all sorts of issues related to that.
Hey there, Megan Kitchen here, creator of the Highlights podcast. Sorry to interrupt, but I would like to ask a small favor if I could. If you appreciate anything about today's episode or it enhances your own point of view, would you please let us know? You can do it easily by sending an email to podcastcomments@pointofview.net. When you email us your feedback, it helps me to create more episodes based on topics that help you and your friends discern a biblical perspective on the world. So, penny for your thoughts? Again, that email is podcastcomments@pointofview.net. Now, back to the episode.
And John, I thought for just a minute we might talk about how, in some respects, this is like a row of dominoes. First, you have the denial of a creator. I remember Richard Dawkins saying that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist, but a denial of a creator, then a denial of human equality. Now, racism existed before Charles Darwin, but this made it more scientifically acceptable. And then also this idea of denial of human exceptionalism. And those three denials you talk about in the middle part of your book are key to understanding what unfolded during the 19th century, isn't it?
Very much so, and especially by the end of the 19th century, going into the progressive era in the early 1900s, where we have a complete sea change in the purposes of American government and the rise of what C.S. Lewis called scientocracy. And there definitely was a change, and those denials were at the core of it.
You know, you and I both talk about politics because you also then have some other denials: denial of limited government, a denial of natural moral law, a denial of the consent of the governed. And at that point, I was again encouraged that you had pictures of a number of people, including Woodrow Wilson, because much of that, as you point out, was being carried on from the 19th century into the 20th century, wasn't it?
It was, and I'd say if anyone was intrigued by Justice Clarence Thomas's, again, his speech just a few days ago, where he highlights the repudiation of the Declaration by people like Woodrow Wilson, read my book and get the backstory. I mean, Justice Thomas's speech was great, but if it whetted your appetite, if you want to know what happened and why, read my book. Just to unpack the logic a little bit about why this change was led to what it did, the founders thought we're fundamentally equal in some key ways, and then also that our rights, our fundamental capacities, our ability to create things, our ability to worship God, our ability to work and be what some Christians call subcreation under God, our abilities that devolve from God, not government. That's what they meant by unalienable rights. These derive from God, not government. And that means that no government can rightfully take them away from us. But if you think that there is no creator, so in fact there aren't really any unalienable rights,
yes.
because then our rights become, well, that's just what the people who are the most powerful want you to have. And in fact, by the end of the 19th century, you had all of the academic political scientists, of which Woodrow Wilson was one. He was later president, but he first started off as a political science professor. They say, oh, we don't believe in those. We know in 1776 they believed in unalienable rights given by God, but we don't believe that anymore. Rights are simply what, and they're really explicit on this. And again, if people doubt this, read my book. They'll get chapter and verse. They were really explicit that, no, rights are just what those in charge grant you with that they think that you merit at this time. And that can change. They could limit it. So there are no fundamental rights. There are no limits to government power. And then beyond that, if people are fundamentally unequal, well, then that's how you get scientocracy. The founders said government had to be based on consent of the governed, because if no one is so superior to anyone else, then you have to govern them by their consent. But if there are people who are so superior that they're godlike powers, basically those who are scientists or quasi people speaking in the name of science, then, well, they have the right to rule. And that's where you get the modern administrative state, where you basically appoint unelected bureaucrats in the name of their scientific expertise, and that they're the ones who are supposed to rule us, not our elected officials, because they're stupid. They're just elected by the stupid people. But it's the unelected experts, and that is the vision of government that Woodrow Wilson and his compatriots proclaimed. And it flowed directly from their repudiation of the truths of the Declaration of Independence.
And I think you've done a great job explaining that, how we have this rise of the bureaucracy and the deep state and the rest. But some people might now say, okay, I'm depressed. Can you help us out? And that's because you have a chapter on Return to the Future. And a couple of books you mentioned. Let me hold this up for those of you watching online. This is the book by Stephen Meyer, Return of the God Hypothesis, which you talk about. And to be fair, let me also mention another book, which I have. You can see I love all these books. Of course, we've interviewed them. And this one by Michael Egner, The Immortal Mind. But let's talk about that, because all of a sudden, the argument was by the turn of the century, Marx, Freud, Darwin, they've explained everything. And so all the great questions that we ask, which we thought Christianity could answer, now those were answered by these atheists. But it turns out that science took an unexpected turn, didn't it?
It did, and to explain that, let me say something that I don't think we've actually discussed here yet, which is the point of my book is, first of all, at the time of the founding, that the founders believed in that there was an actual creator who gives us rights and things. That certainly did flow from a biblical perspective, but they also thought that the science at the time of the founding established that there was a creator. All the founders of modern science, whether it be Sir Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle, all of these people thought that nature provided concrete evidence that there was a creator. So when the founders of America said, all men are created equal, endowed by their creator, they weren't just making a faith statement. They were also, and of course I think the Bible provides good evidence of things, but they weren't just saying that, well, that's because of what the Bible says. They also thought that nature herself, and the Bible itself teaches this, pointed to God. And if this actually amazed me, because I've studied the founding, but to write this book, I read more deeply on what the founders said about what is often known as natural theology, how nature herself points to God. And it turned out that founders like Benjamin Franklin were reading these scientists in England, among other places, who were making these arguments that science itself points to a creator. And so what I would say, that's one of the key things that people don't understand, is that the founders actually did draw on early modern science to actually support their belief in a creator. So it wasn't just they weren't just making an abstract statement that was just philosophical. They thought it was really pointing, reality pointed to that, and nature pointed to that. So now we skip ahead after the detour from Darwin and the atheist materialist trying to hijack science. The great thing about today, the good news, if you will, is that science is going back to those original ideas of the founders of modern science. That science itself is showing that there is a beginning to the universe. Well, that requires a creator. That there are things that are fine-tuned to allow us to exist at all, again points to a creator, and that human beings are unique. So some of the things, the books that you talked about by, my colleague Steve Meyer, colleague and friend, and then Michael Egner about, scientific evidence that we have an immaterial soul that survives death. So it's really interesting how science today, the actual findings of science, not the talking head atheist, but the actual findings of science, are pointing back to reality in the same way that science at the time of the founding actually pointed to that reality. And that's really exciting. People don't need to be embarrassed about this. If you're a Christian, you don't need to be embarrassed about believing that there's a God who's a creator. And you shouldn't allow anyone to intimidate you to thinking, oh, well, that's your fairy tale faith belief, and, but science has refuted that. No. Reality points to the truth, and that's certainly true of modern science, and it's getting harder and harder for the old-time religion atheists to try to keep hijacking science, and that's exciting.
I might just mention, too, that one of the other tremendous benefits of your book reminded me of some of the things you've published in the past with Jonathan Wells on the icons of evolution. In one of those, you dismiss this myth that there's really only 1% difference between humans and chimps, and take on a couple of these other myths that are there. Plus, of course, present the positive information as well about the case for an immortal soul, the neurosurgeon's case for the existence of a soul, and of course all the material that we've talked about in terms of where science is really beginning to come back to what was very much the teachings of many of those great scientists, whether it was Francis Bacon or Isaac Newton or a variety of others. You've got some great pictures of some of those individuals. I might just mention that it has been endorsed by all sorts of people I've had on this program, Newt Gingrich and former Senator Sam Brownback and David Limbaugh and George Gilder and Bill Dembski, including Dr. Mark David Hall, who we've just had recently on the program. And when we come to the film, The Story of Everything, we have a place where you can watch the trailer. And also there's a great endorsement from our friend Lee Strobel, who's been in studio with us many times. And this is an attempt to take some of these very important principles, for example, in Stephen Meyer's book and other books as well, and really set forth the fact that science today really does emphasize the fact that the Christian message is true, that we are indeed endowed by our Creator. And it seems like this film is another way to get some of the ideas of the Discovery Institute into the heart and minds of many of our listeners and viewers.
Yeah, I mean, this film, The Story of Everything, is a great example of the sea change that is happening in our culture right now on this issue of science and faith. Whereas, when I started in this whole area maybe a few decades ago, the people at the top of the food chain, so to speak, were the people like Richard Dawkins, the people who were claiming, science for atheism. That has changed. And in fact, in this film, if you don't know or think that it's changed, you need to watch this film. And this film, by the way, is the perfect film to take. If you have kids who have lost their faith, if you have friends who are mixed up, they don't really think, well, that's nice fairy story that you believe, but I don't really think that there's necessarily evidence for any of that. Invite them. This is not a culture war film. It's a film about exploration. It's not going to bop you over the head with a sledgehammer, but it's the perfect film to bring people who don't really know that God exists yet, and who are muddled or need it to. And so please think about doing it. And it's getting attention. So just last week, there was a major review of this in the Wall Street Journal. That actually, I love the phrase that the reviewer used, the sheer nerve of the thing, which was pointing out, and this was not being negative. The guy liked liked the film, but the nerve of it in actually going after these scientific atheists, and he pointed out how the film actually gives clips of where you can see Neil deGrasse Tyson and these other people recapitulating their same old, and how it becomes apparent by the end of the film that they have not been keeping up. They have not been keeping up with the science actually shows.
And again, I might just mention that some of the individuals that are in the film are people we've interviewed. Of course, we mentioned Steve Meyer, I just mentioned Lee Strobel, but John Lennox, Jay Richards, of course, we've had him on before. Timothy McGrew, we've had him in studio a number of times. Dr. James Tour, as well as a couple of other individuals that are associated with the organization. And this is one of the reasons why I really encourage people to find out a little bit more about the Discovery Institute. And we have a link to your website, but if you could for just a minute, talk about how we can use this, because again, you have devoted 150 plus pages to the book, but you've devoted a whole section on resources for digging deeper and endnotes. It does seem to me that this could be a discussion. Yesterday, John, I was at a dinner, and the person sitting across from me says, you know what, and he was just reading one of your latest books from the Discovery Institute, and he says, you know, we get together, we both read the book, and then we get together and discuss it. And it does seem to me that as much as people can benefit by reading your book individually, I think this could also be a discussion point. Certainly this film could be a discussion point that you could gather together after the film and talk about what you've learned. So can you give us some ideas on how we can use some of the Discovery Institute resources in an effective way?
Oh, yeah. Well, you know, with regard to my book, I really felt led to write this largely because you know, this year is our 250th anniversary as a nation, 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So people are talking and thinking about that. And so this gives you, whether it be in your small group, whether it be with your friends, whether just you get a group of people together to discuss, with your kids, at your, whether you homeschool or at your Christian school, or that this year, up to July 4th and even after that, really provides a platform for you to hold discussion. Well, what did the founders really mean by all men are created equal? And did you know there's actually scientific evidence for that? And what does it really mean that we have human dignity and that things should be based on consent of the governed? A lot of people are discussing these things this year. So use that book as a resource. And then with regard to the film, again, I would just urge people to think about whether they have kids, maybe they're adult kids who have sort of fallen away and are now lukewarm, and part of it is that they've sort of been persuaded, well, you know, things are just sort of complicated, and the biblical worldview is sort of outdated, and the idea of the Creator, yeah, I sort of do believe that, but I don't really think it's real. I mean, it doesn't have a claim on how I live my life or whether I get right with God. That's the key. You know, many people even today, you know, they won't be outright atheists, but they've basically become practical atheists or practical agnostics. And a film like The Story of Everything, this is an antidote to that, and it will be a discussion starter because the evidence is not easy to caricature or get around. I mean, it really is powerful. Now, it's a heady film. It's, you know, some of the stuff might be hard for people to understand, but, you know, it's done in an engaging way. And by the end of it, I will pledge to you, but, you know, by the end of that, you know, an hour and 40 minutes, whoever you've brought to that, they're not going to be just smarmy dismissing, because they're going to have stuff that they're going to really have to grapple with. And if they've kept the idea of God or you know, the question of God at arm's length, this is going to drive home that, you know, reality is pretty clear and it has a claim on them. You know, so it's I think what Francis Schaeffer used to call pre-evangelism, if you're a Christian, this is very, we don't have a lot of these, frankly, and there are a lot of great Christian apologists and things, so I don't want to be negative about that at all, but sometimes Christians, we're just speaking to ourselves, and we create even films that just speak to our own people. And there's validity to that, and that's great. But this is one of those films that actually is primarily created for people who aren't Christians, for people who aren't really sure about even if God exists. And but it's also great for Christians because it would help, solidify your faith and give you things that you could talk to your friends about. But this is a film you're not going to be embarrassed about to invite someone, no matter what their beliefs are, no matter who they voted for, because this is not a political film. Sometimes, we as Christians sort of meld it all together, and I have very strong political beliefs, and I express some of them at the foundational level in the book that I just wrote. But the film, The Story of Everything, is not a culture war film. It's an inviting film. And so if you have people in your life, and we all do, who are, like I said, not quite sure where they're at and are really searching, this is a once, I don't want to say once in a lifetime, there are other, but this is a really key opportunity. Don't miss it.
Yes. John West, I appreciate all that you do up there at the Discovery Institute, and I really enjoyed your book because I have degrees both in science and government, so every one of the pages was interesting to me, and I appreciate you being with us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby, and for all the great work that you're doing at Probe.
Well, hope you enjoyed the interview because, again, this is a very important issue. And if you'd like to know more, of course, you can go to the website, which is pointofview.net. We look forward to seeing you next time right here on Point of View Highlights.